When was the last time you had a real and meaningful conversation? It's no secret that we live in an argumentative culture and that nearly a third of people have actually stopped talking to a friend or family member over a disagreement. Today's guest seeks to end this stalemate. Sean McDowell is a Christian apologist who hosts civil discussions on explosive topics on his wildly popular YouTube channel. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks for having me on, Walter.
All right. For some who know what the word apologist means, they get what you're trying to do. For others, what is an apologist?
Well, apologetics comes from the passage in 1 Peter 3:15 that says, "Sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer for the hope within. Give it with gentleness and give it with respect." Now, in the Greek, the term apologia meant to give a defense, oftentimes in a legal setting, for something you believe. Now, it appears about a dozen times, if I'm not mistaken, in other parts of the New Testament, including Acts. But an apologist is not somebody with a special spiritual gift to do this. It's actually all Christians. We're all called to be ready with an answer for the hope within. But typically, an apologist would be somebody who writes books, speaks, debates, tries to actively advance the Christian faith by making the positive case for Christianity and responding to objections that come against it.
How did you specifically get into this work then?
Well, there's a few factors. I think anybody who recognizes my father, Josh McDowell, who this fall is celebrating 6 decades of ministry with Cru doing apologetics, it's impossible to unravel my story from his. He really was a trailblazer, writing books and speaking and debating when there were almost no apologetics resources available. So he never told me growing up, you should be an apologist, you should follow my footsteps. Not once did I feel that pressure. But I remember my dad living it out, talking with us, modeling it, and just in an attractive way that's like, wow, he loves what he does. He's affecting people's lives. This seems true to me. So that's a piece of it. And then going through my own period of question and doubts in college, even having a great apologist as a father, made me realize, wow, there's some tough objections that are out there. I need to be ready to answer these. And then I started wanting to work with students, and I thought about coaching and teaching and doing apologetics. And 5 minutes into working with students, even in the 90s, when everybody was saying the emerging church is here and apologetics doesn't matter anymore, and by the way, they couldn't have been more wrong on that account, you work with students 5 minutes in, they have questions about life, about the Bible, about God, about suffering, about sexuality. And so just given my background, my interests, my experience, and not a lot of people in the late 90s, early 2000s were doing apologetics to students. Very, very few. So I thought, here's an avenue, there's a need, I'm interested in this, I can make a contribution, let's go.
Well, I personally have benefited from your father's ministry and now benefited from yours as well. I remember some of his writings as a very new Christian were quite instrumental to address the many concerns and questions I had about my newly found faith. And yet we're at a time where even language of making a case for something or debating the truthfulness of Christianity can connote a kind of disagreeableness or, frankly, a pompous approach to, hey, I'm going to prove that I'm right and you're wrong. And I get deeply the sense that you're not about that. I mean, there's truth, but there's a way to get about the conversation. Why is it that you see in this particular moment, it's not just what we have to say, but how we say it that is so critical?
So if I go back to my dad's experience when he's doing apologetics, I think maybe late 60s into the 70s, the free speech platform, people communicated just boldly and aggressively, and there were not a lot of Christians willing to stand up and debate Marxists, debate atheists, to go on the free speech platform when people would shout you down and throw stuff at you. There was a level of like, we need this bold, strong Christian voice to stand up and challenge the way people were communicating in that era. And my dad was just and is wired for that. But culture has shifted radically, largely because of social media. Now everybody has a platform. And you might say, to get attention, we have to provoke, we insult, we have to say things negative. We're more likely to get views if it's shocking and alarming. Even we've seen with social media, there's certain metrics that favor emotionally charged tweets and posts over others. And so understandably, to a degree, there's a lot of Christians saying, hey, we got to draw eyes and draw attention and play by the same rules. Now, there is a time to provoke. And there's some ridiculous ideas in our culture that we need to call out and point out that they're ridiculous. But amidst all this cacophony of noises, we have this cancel culture that very quickly, if you say the wrong things in the wrong way, and we see this on the left and we see this on the right, we will pile on you on social media, try to get you canceled, whether it's a speaking event, whether it's your job, whether it's your reputation. And so either Christians cower back in fear, understandably, or they jump on the cancel culture bandwagon and decide that they just want to cancel other people. In this moment, it seems to me, voices that speak with confidence and with calmness and try to build bridges rather than walls kind of rise to the surface. So there's something about just a word spoken softly, something about finding common ground with people that is different and speaks out today in a way people don't expect somebody to say, you know what, that's a good point. People don't expect you to build bridges with people who see the world differently. And so I just think there's a cultural moment where I have a chance to be known by our kindness, known by our civility, without compromising truth.
And is this why you wrote the book, End the Stalemate?
Well, so Tim Muehlhoff, who's my co-author, is a communications scholar, PhD. He's done this at the doctoral level at UNC. He's been practicing this in different ways. It was his idea. He came to me because my PhD is in apologetics and worldview studies. His PhD is in communications. And he was like, Sean, I've been doing the scholarly work on the power of just common ground, what's called perspective taking, a ritual form of communication rather than transmission view. He's like, Sean, you seem to be doing this in your personal life, on stage, on YouTube channel. Let's partner together and write this. And in the back of my mind, I had always wanted to write a book like this for a while. And I thought I could write it with my friend. He's got a lot of the scholarly chops behind it. We're living a cultural moment right now where it's desperately needed. And so no book is easy to write, but it was probably the easiest book to write in the sense that I had such passion and energy for it and really just had to communicate what I've been trying to do for the past couple decades. And so that became End the Stalemate.
We're going to get to some of the terms that you just thrown out, perspective taking and other aspects of developing kind of a better, more positive way of engagement. But I still want to draw out a bit more of how we got into this place where, we've moved from anger to contempt, not just being angry with maybe friends or family members, but having a contempt that causes us to walk away. Social media, the algorithms of it may incentivize that kind of thing. But what are some of the other factors that have gotten us into this situation?
I think another factor might be the rise in mental health issues, concern, illness, relational brokenness. We've all talked about and been concerned for the past decade or two, but specifically since COVID, loneliness and anxiety. And one of the phrases we've all heard is that hurt people hurt people. I mean, if we are hurting emotionally, which is true for Christians and non-Christians, it's harder to be civil and kind and gracious with people because we act out of our hurt and our brokenness. So sometimes when I see people canceling others and acting a certain way, I try to think, gosh, how has this person learned to treat human beings this way? And second, how's this person canceled in their own life? So I think that's a piece of it. I think second, we've also just lost how to communicate. Basic communication skills like listening well is something we've lost, maybe because of our attention spans. When I think about communication, I was an undergrad communication major. And really simply put, you have the sender, you have the message, and then you have the receiver. And most people don't think about, they say, okay, I have this content, this message, and me as the sender, how do I send this message in a way it will be best received? We don't ask that question. Many people, especially online, Christians included, we just communicate in a way that makes us look good or makes us feel good, more so than saying, how is this going to land with others? So I think in some ways, we've just lost the ability to communicate well. And of course, social media contributes to this. I think we've also just seen a fracturing in our culture, especially in the evangelical world, where you used to have figures like Billy Graham that could transcend differences. And in many ways, my dad did this, where he would work with different denominations around the Bible's true, Jesus is God, he's risen from the grave, biblical sexuality, let's go. Now there's this fracturing, like before people work with you, they want to know, would you use a preferred pronoun or not? Would you go to a gay wedding? What do you view about this issue? What do you at that issue? And there's just so much fracturing and a lack of unity that I think painfully, affects the way we communicate with one another. The last piece I would say is we've shifted to a point where I am what I believe. I am what I believe. So especially now we've shifted in issues of identity. It used to be that I conform myself to a truth outside of me, and I'm part of a tribe that embraces that truth. But we've seen an epistemological shift now that says I am what I feel. I am what I believe. And if you don't affirm what I believe, you're bigoted and you're hateful and you're intolerant and fill in the blank. So the idea of just saying, gosh, I disagree with you firmly, but I still love you. In so many circles today, that's not possible. If you don't affirm me, you don't love me. So to answer your question as best I can, Walter, I think it's a perfect storm of social media, our inability to communicate, certain mental health issues and relational brokenness that has emerged, and an epistemological shift about who we are and our inability to separate what we believe from our core identity.
Yeah, there are a lot of these factors, any one of which would pose a significant challenge, but all of which together conspire to create as you described it, this perfect storm that's overwhelming, that seems and feels like an intractable problem. Of course, as people of faith, we would say this is a real issue, but it's also an opportunity for us to step into this moment.
Amen.
One of the places that you step into where you see these storms unfolding are educational institutions, speaking at colleges, or you work at a theological institution. And the conversations now about higher ed revolve around cancel culture, revolve around the debates that are happening on positions of, what you believe is happening in the Middle East, what you believe about human sexuality. These become profoundly divisive issues. What have you seen in the unfolding of these debates on college campuses, in the theological institutions? Are these just a few instances that get highlighted in an op-ed to instigate, as you have noted, the hits on social media? Or are you actually seeing these things unfold in these places?
This is a tough question because I don't think it's either or. I think there's some of both. I think we've clearly seen, especially with some of these, in support of the Palestinian cause at places like Ivy League schools, that we just saw the third president step down for failing to defend, or being forced to step down, failing to defend Jewish students. Well, wherever you stand on that issue, that's not the point here. It's very clear that these rallies brought to the surface some deep anti-Semitism that had existed and not been dealt with. And there's been a number of people who have gone back, and we've covered this on our podcast, where we kind of do this weekly cultural update. And we've done a deep dive on some people, even New York Times op-eds, who've gone in and said, let's look at what's being taught in these classes here at these universities. And it's clearly there's shifts that are taking place that not a lot of people were aware of. So I think in part what happened in COVID was a lot of parents are seeing their kids Zoom going, wait a minute, this is being taught in a public school, in a classroom, whether it's issues tied to sexuality, race, other topics. Those issues were there, but brought to the surface. And I think some of these rallies around Hamas and Israel and the Palestinian cause also brought to the surface issues that were there. So I do think it's a real phenomena. With that said, how widespread it is to other universities, it's hard to tell when you get down from some of these elitist universities. I was speaking at a public school in, I'll just say in North Carolina, and I was asked to speak on a biblical view of homosexuality. And I said, are you sure you want me to speak on that issue at a public university? I'm happy to, but I don't want to draw any unnecessary attention. Why don't we approach this differently? And they're like, we're not like some of these other universities. People will hear you out and probably not make a big deal about it. I was like, okay. And so I went and they didn't make a big deal about it. Even though plenty of non-Christians came, we had a civil discourse and we had wonderful dialogue. So it's hard to know how much is in elitist schools that are drawn to versus some of the other lesser known, smaller colleges. I don't know how to answer that. In my experience, the vast majority of college students want to have meaningful dialogue on issues that matter if we'll approach them in the right spirit and in the right way. I think that's why people resonate with a lot of stuff I do on my channel. And I've spoken to places like Berkeley. Now, I don't speak on, should Christians support Israel there? Or I don't speak on LGBTQ issues there, but I've done forums there where I say, I'm going to defend the Christian faith, bring your questions. And mostly Christians came, but a lot of non-believers came, and they were civil, and they engaged, and they asked good questions. So I think in one sense, it both can be true, that there's real concerns being taught at many universities, and it's more systemic than we realize, issues that deeply should concern Christians. But on the flip side, most college students are willing to have civil, thoughtful, spiritual conversations if we approach them the right way at the right time.
Sean, I imagine there have been moments where you had to do some diffusing. By and large, there are civil conversations. It's really encouraging to hear. I've been very encouraged to be a part of many civil discussions on issues that are incredibly difficult, complex, and even explosive. But there are all these moments where something, goes off the rail, or there isn't the kind of relational context to understand where you're coming from. And so you sense a bit of hostility or defensiveness in the least. What have you seen in those moments? A moment in which someone would come up to you because they don't know you, they don't have that kind of presumption to believe that you will be civil. They assume that this is going to be a contentious discussion. What have you seen help to diffuse that kind of moment?
Well, first off, there's plenty of times that I've responded, Walter, where I thought, you know what, I could do way better here. So I've learned from my own failures in this regard, not handling it the way that I should. I've taken tweets down. I've apologized to people. So I don't have this perfectly dialed in for sure. But I can think of a couple instances that come to mind. This was a number of years ago in a forum with university students. A fellow came, an African-American, and the topic was not related to race at all. And he clearly had some hurt and some anger at Christians in the church. And I don't remember the specifics of what he said, but it was very defensive and very angry. And I just started by saying, hey, thank you for coming. I appreciate you weighing in. Although tonight is focused on a little bit of a different topic, tell me briefly your experience. And I said, you know what? Would you be willing, when this is done, to have coffee with me and just share your experience? I'd love to hear you more. And maybe we could find a way of doing an event like this together in the future where we talk about that topic. And in that case, it worked. I think he wanted to be heard. He wanted to just express his hurt. He still had some issues he thought the church and culture should deal with, and I tried to identify and recognize that. I mean, there's a balance between hijacking the evening and spending 15 minutes on an issue that was not related to the topic, but also showing kindness to somebody and listening and learning and building a relationship. In that case, it worked out. So when somebody raises the temperature, my instinct, what I try to do is think, how do I lower the temperature? If I'm going to raise it and go back at them, it's just not going to help. So how do I lower the temperature? Well, the Bible has a lot to say about a soft word turns away wrath. A gentle word breaks a bone. And so I think of a time I was live streaming, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I usually have someone moderate the comments, and I don't mind if people disagree with me for and against, but sometimes comments get so personal and divisive, they just hijack and sidetrack the conversation. And as best I can remember, I could just see this insult fest going on, and I knew some of the folks were Christians, and said to a guy, well, something to the effect of, why are you even here? He's like, why am I here? He goes, I was wounded as a veteran. What do you mean? Why am I here? I have a right to be here as much as anybody. And I saw this and just stepped in. Again, as best I can remember, said something like, man, thank you for your service. I have no idea what happened to you or why. I'm not going to pretend to explain so. But you're welcome here anytime. Thanks for taking the time to join this. Something to that effect. And it was silence. It stopped because a gentle word turns away wrath. That is the first position to try. Now, if it doesn't and somebody gets more hostile, then you've got to ramp it up. But our default should try to be, listen, this person is probably hurt. There's probably a backstory. And if I can model how to just love somebody graciously rather than respond out of anger, I think that person feels respected. You model for the audience, and at least more likely than not, you'll have a win.
Mm-hmm. Sean, I'm struck by several things that you've said. One, right at the beginning, you talked about you're not perfect. You've taken down tweets. You've apologized. If we just had more people who would be willing to apologize and own up to their fallibility, we would be in a much better place. So thank you for even making that comment. And this notion of stepping into the shoes of another person or trying to understand the perspective of the other person. Is this what you mean by perspective taking when you talk about the importance of doing that in communication?
This is a term that my co-author, again, Tim Muehlhoff, has done extensive research on. And what we mean by this is doing our best humanly possible to quite literally step into somebody else's shoes and try to see the world as they do and feel the world as they do. Now, first off, that's a way to just steel man somebody's position to make sure we're not setting up a straw man when we eventually respond. But I've also found it makes us much more compassionate towards people when we at least try to understand why they see the world as they do. Now, I think most people have good reasons for what they believe, or at least minimally, they think they have good reasons for what they believe. And so when we take the time to just try to understand empathetically, it's going to change the way we communicate with these people who see the world differently. I also think it's an act of love to do so. I think, one of the most powerful things we can do to somebody today is to just listen and to just understand. One of the reasons we don't do this, and you asked about this earlier, is because I think in our minds, we think that listening and understanding and perspective taking equals affirmation. If I really lean in and grasp and see the world as you do, I'm affirming what you believe. Well, that just doesn't follow at all. I can understand and empathize. I mean, obviously, there's a limit. Do I want to empathize with somebody who's a white supremacist? There might be some Christians who'd say, yes, I really hesitate with that. I want to empathize with that human being and their life experiences. But that worldview, yeah, I will personally pass. So there are limits we get to, but I think we're unwilling to often do this because we think, oh, if I try to see the world as you do, that means I'm affirming your viewpoint. That just doesn't follow. I think we can better respond emotionally and intellectually if we really understand what someone believes, why they believe it, and how they feel about it. And by the way, taking the time to perspective take with somebody, it just builds goodwill in that person. It communicates, you matter to me. I take you seriously. I care about you. It communicates those things. And it's just going to at least contribute more likely to a better communication climate.
Sean, you're describing something that seems to me the flip side consequence of making our beliefs central to our identity. You can't disconnect them. And therefore, if you don't accept a certain belief of mine, then you don't accept me. And it leads to this whole deep sense of rejection. But the corollary would be is if we can't sit and listen to someone and recognize that there's a story to be told, that we could disentangle whatever view that they may have on a particular topic from who they are and the dignity and the love that we ought to show that person. In some ways, we've just bought into that worldview, that beliefs and identity are one and the same. And this skill of listening, ironically, is what I would imagine to be a profoundly Christian way of responding to saying we're all sinful human beings. Thank you, God, that you took the time to incarnate yourself to take our perspective and enter into our world because you were able to disassociate our sinful patterns of belief and behavior from the essential dignity of being created in your image, and you love us. And so there is this need to kind of see the irony in the moment that whether we play the card of saying, if you don't accept everything about me, you accept nothing about me, by playing the card of, well, I can't listen to anything about you because that means I have to accept everything about you. There's just a profound irony in that. And yet this perspective taking is a risk, and you've talked about this.
That's right.
But you literally have tried to do this. Like you've literally tried to take the world of an atheist and enter into it as an atheist, as I understand. Like what has that been like?
Oh, that's an exercise that I do of role playing, where I've did this at conferences and churches, and it really just started with my own students when I was teaching high school full time, as I would role play all sorts of views. I'd role play a pro-choicer, I would role play and make a case for same-sex marriage, I would role play a Muslim, and I understand that there's times I make arguments and some atheists and others have been like, I would make a different argument and you didn't represent us. I'm like, okay, that's fair. I'm doing my best. I'm not actually an atheist. But it certainly made me think and see how Christian audiences treat me. Sometimes I'm standing up there going, wow, if I really were an atheist, I'm like a project to be defeated, not a person to love. This doesn't feel really good. I read books and I go, okay, what's the best atheist argument I could make when I'm role playing? I think that way. So I'm not going to pretend I see the world exactly as an atheist does. Of course not. There are limits and perspective taking, but it's given me a lot of compassion and I think a lot of insight into hopefully communicate better with atheists and hopefully treat them differently. Now, one thing I want to throw in there, because I think you beautifully captured the confusion that we sometimes make in our inability to listen equals affirming with somebody, one question I'd ask people is, why don't we listen? Why don't we listen well? Well, one reason we said is because we assume that listening equals affirmation. I think another reason might be is we really don't know what we believe and why we believe it. If I really listen to your story, I might be persuaded by you and have to change my beliefs, which is painful. And so when I do this atheist encounter you're talking about, I'll ask audiences when I'm done, give me individual words that describe how you treat me. And I kid you not, if I did a numerical analysis, probably the most common word people say is hostile. We treated you with hostility or defensiveness as a whole. And then I'll say, well, why? I'll say, let me suggest to you that one reason is maybe a lot of you here don't know what you believe and why you believe it. And when I start challenging you and you have to listen, that makes you uncomfortable. And so if we want to have these kind of civil dialogue with people, we got to really think through what we believe, why we believe it. Back to how you started this, 1 Peter 3:15, be ready with an answer for the hope within. And so developing our theological and apologetic views actually is one way of giving us the confidence to not be so threatened by people who see the world differently.
You know, I can see this when you take on this atheist encounter because, you know, someone's salvation, eternal destiny is at stake. So you want to rise to the occasion. But I've sensed within the Christian community that we could maybe concede that we should do this with our non-Christian neighbors and friends because we want to see them come to Christ. But when it comes to speaking to other Christians who hold different beliefs, there's the sense that, well, that's a different matter because, you know, they're heretical and we need to put a kibosh on that. You've taken a different approach. You've chosen to engage with Christians who hold beliefs quite different from yours or even heterodox beliefs. I think of interviews you've done with folks. And why, first of all, why do you do that? And what do you hope to get out of it? So let's just begin. Why would you even do something like that?
So, for example, I've talked with a few individuals who describe themselves as progressive Christians. One reason I have this conversation is I consistently hear from progressive Christians. They believe they were mistreated and they have hurt at the hands of the church. That is one of the pieces, if not the driving piece, pushing them away. And so if I can treat them just with kindness and civility as human beings, or other progressive Christians who might watch this, it might make them emotionally reconsider and think, okay, you know, I maybe there's more to this. And they'd be willing to watch that more so than somebody calling them heretic and attacking them personally. That's one reason. Second is I also really value clarity. So in some of my conversations, I've taken some criticism for this. People are like, why are you platforming others? These people are heretics. You need to call them wolves in sheep clothing. Like some people have said that, fine. But most people who watch this and understand will say, thank you for drawing out the clarity of what you believe, which I would call the historic Christian faith broadly, and what certain progressive Christians believe about the resurrection, about the deity of Christ. So I've had individual progressive Christians come on and say they believe that Jesus sinned. I mean, if Jesus sinned, he can't be the perfect sacrifice for our sins, and he needs a savior. So now we're talking about a very different gospel. When we talk about the resurrection, I've had a progressive Christian say, you know, sometimes I think it's metaphorical, sometimes I think it's historical. In other words, it's not a necessary doctrine like I think Paul clearly lays out in 1 Corinthians 15, that if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. So I'm trying to have a civil, respectful conversation where I just let's find where we have common ground, but let's draw out the clarity so we understand exactly what's going on, why. And anybody watching this goes, oh, when you say progressive Christian, even though some might use that term differently, here's what you mean. wow, now I know exactly where that stands with what we might call a historic Christian faith.
And I imagine that this process, kind of getting back to the comment you made of being viewed as a project, or something to be defeated, like this process for you is deeply humanizing of other people. Like you are engaging, yes, in persuasion, but in active listening and in hearing these stories, you begin to see the whole person, and that changes things. Is that right?
I hope so. Again, there's a time and change for people. There's a time for people to call out false ideas and false prophets boldly. I would never say there's not that time. But there's also a time to just treat somebody not as a project, but as a human being and to listen to them. I think in part this communicates, I'm not threatened by your ideas. I'm willing to listen to them. And if you're right, I'd change my mind. And that shows a certain level of confidence that I've had some people reach out to me and say, it's interesting. Anytime you have a channel, some people can resonate with it, some people won't. Some people are like, Sean, you're not hard enough on people. You don't call people heretics. I can't watch your channel anymore. You're too soft. I'm like, okay. And then I have some people say, I specifically watch your channel because you treat people with kindness, even though you don't compromise truth. That's my lane. That's my calling. That's my interest. Other people can engage and should engage differently. But I think there's a whole lot of people today in our cancel angry culture just looking for something different. And I think, frankly, most people are not prophets. Most people are not professional apologists that can slice and dice somebody else's views and win an argument. But everybody can listen. Everybody can ask questions. Everybody can find common ground. Everybody can love their neighbor. And then appropriate times and appropriate ways, push back and then share the gospel. This is something everybody can do. And I want to equip many people and hopefully model for them how to do it.
So you're the professional, and you've also just noted that not everyone will be a prophet. Why wouldn't it just be easy to say, I don't want to deal with these explosive topics. I'll just be nice to the people around me. Why is it not only can anyone do this, you've just made a case for, anyone could do this, but why should people do this? Why should you engage in explosive topics when you're not the professional apologist with a communications degree, when you're not a prophet always ready to address an explosive topic? Why should we engage?
Well, if we are going to engage on these explosive topics, and I think we should, we have to do it in the right way at the right time. So I've made mistakes at the Thanksgiving dinner table with non-Christian extended family members around, and later just thought, oh, what was I doing? My love for these conversations got ahead of me, and that was not wise to do so. So I think we should. But we have to think through the time and the place and the setting to have these kinds of conversations. That's step number one. Step number two is because the Christian faith has something to say to every issue that's out there. I co-host a podcast called Think Biblically. And part of the purpose of it is that we post interviews with like professors and scholars typically on a Tuesday. Then every Wednesday we do a weekly cultural update. We pick 3 or 4 news stories and talk about how to think biblically about them. We've done the death penalty. I think years ago we talked about the vaccine. We've talked about CRT. We've talked about pretty much every controversial issue you can think of because the Bible speaks to that. When we don't talk about those issues, we're kind of saying we can siphon our faith over to spiritual things over here, but it doesn't speak to all these issues. Now, of course, how it speaks to issues like, say, war is going to be different than, say, vaccines. But there's principles that apply and overlap. And I guess the final thing is I think not all, but many non-Christians want to know what Christians think about these topics. I found that many Muslims are open to talking with Christians. In fact, I've befriended a local imam and we had coffee not long ago and just sat down and talked about life and talked about some controversial issues totally respectfully. And I'm interested in what he thinks, and he's interested in what I think. So I think most people are willing to have these kind of conversations and eager, and they're opportunities to learn for ourselves, to build relationship with people, but also to just gently and wisely push back and say things like, have you thought about this? And what if the data points this direction? And just ask people questions, ultimately with a gospel, end surrounding it in some fashion.
So we've covered a lot of terrain. Leave us with some concluding advice about how to engage. We've talked about why we should, but how should we engage in these explosive topics?
So first off, you don't have to do it perfectly. You're going to make mistakes. Someone made a video this week of a time they thought I failed to defend the cosmological argument and share the gospel. And there was this huge online discussion. Did Sean fall short? I'm like, okay, these are fair discussions. We should have these conversations. And so give yourself permission that you're not going to do this perfectly. Now, fortunately, you probably don't have the level of platform that I have where as many people will pile on you. Maybe not. But give yourself permission to fail. But second, just start where you're at. Don't wait until you feel like you're a professional to do this. Just start where you're at, maybe in your comfort zone, and get better at it. Having conversations like learning how to cook or working out or doing anything, it's a skill that takes time. Now, the best way to do it is to just learn how to ask good questions. Anybody can ask questions. Walter, in the Gospels and Acts, we have 340 questions that Jesus asked. In the letters of Paul, there's 262 questions. The God who made our brains and made us to know him and know others engaged us largely by asking questions. So give yourself permission to fail, start where you're at, and just ask questions. And make sure your heart is one of love and curiosity. More than anything else, these skills we talk about, how to listen and repeat back somebody's views, these are all important skills. But if somebody's heart really is, I want to love my neighbor and I'm curious, you are 90% of the way there having meaningful spiritual conversations, which really may give you a chance to share your faith with somebody.
Sean, my final question to you. What do you pray when you know that you're about to enter into a difficult, explosive conversation, or you're just right in the middle of it? What is it that you pray?
Oh, gosh, I have had that experience quite a bit. I pray, God, just give me wisdom to ask the right questions, to respond in the right fashion, to focus on issues that matter and not get caught up in issues that don't matter. It's so easy in a conversation to take a side trail off and lose the focus of what really matters. So often just pray, God, give me the right question. God, what do I focus on? When do I jump in and cut this person off? I just pray for wisdom to navigate a conversation. Sometimes I just pray for my heart. I'm like, God, just change my heart. I'm not feeling love towards this person right now. In fact, I feel myself getting angry. God, help me on my face and my reaction, genuinely be loving and patient with this person. Those are probably the two big things that I pray.
Sean, thank you so much for the wisdom and the genuine charity that you've shared with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Walter.